Hi, my name is Aidan and welcome to another episode of the BIPOCanadian podcast. Today, we're going to take a look at Saskatchewan's education system, touching on the experiences of local students and teachers of color and the representation or lack thereof of BIPOC educators in our province. Our guest today is Helen Vangool, a teacher in Saskatoon who strives for inclusivity both in and outside of the classroom. She's written and spoken about her perspectives as a Black educator on CBC Saskatchewan, and today we're so happy to have her here with us. Thank you so much for coming onto our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about what your experience was like growing up as a student of a visible minority, and how did that develop into being actively involved in social justice education in and outside of the classroom?
Well, growing up, I was always the only Black kid in the classroom. I was the only visible minority in general. So I always felt like I didn't quite belong and kind of othered because, teachers didn't really talk to me about racism, about any of the microaggressions I was facing, about my culture, um, anything. I kind of just felt like I was just there. And as I continued to go through the education system, it just kind of got worse, is what I would say. Especially in high school, it became a lot more evident. And when you're young, um, you don't really notice as much. I felt, anyways, as a kid, I didn't really understand what was going on, and so it was tough. And then as I got older and things happened in the classroom or someone would say something like in regards to my color, I just didn't understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Conversations about race weren't normalized. And I just never wanted any other student to feel that way. And so when I became a teacher, um, I make sure that my students don't feel the way that I felt. I make conversations about race normal. When racism happens in the classroom or is happening in the world around us, we talk about it. Um, I think the more that we normalize those conversations, the more students don't feel, I guess they feel like they belong more so. At least I can't speak for every student, but at least that was my experience.
Yeah, it's so important to uh, create just a safe environment, and that's so awesome that that's something that you're working so hard to create.
Yeah.
Um, all of us at the BIPOC Canadian have received a Saskatchewan education at some level in our schooling, so we've all been through sort of those awkward class, dilemmas like you were mentioning. Um, Oftentimes, like you said, as one of the few kids of color in the room. Um, you also attended school here studying psychology and education at the U of S, and now you're an educator in our province. So, how do you approach these situations in a little bit more depth?
So first, nothing is off the table in my classroom. If students have any questions, especially about things that are going on in the world, it's addressed. We don't pretend like it's not happening because I feel like when we do things like that, we aren't really examining what's going on in society. Again, like I said before, we normalize conversations regarding race and racism. It's okay to point out that someone is different than you. Um, it just depends on how we go into that. So really, how it's different now is that we're not only focusing, when we do talk about racism, we're not just focusing on individual racism, which I think is what a lot of people do, right? So and so called me um, a bad name, or so and so did this, or they think about the physical violence as opposed to the bigger picture, which is identifying and challenging policies, procedures, organizations, and how they are built to benefit white people and oppress people of color. So in the classroom, the goal for me is to talk about that. So looking around at people, for example, one of the lessons when we talk about systemic racism is looking at who's in your classroom. Look at the teachers around you. Do they look like you? Look at your principals, your VP. Do they look like you? Like questions like that. And then when you have a class that's mostly white, they'll probably nod their heads, right? And if you have a class that's diverse, most will not. And then you kind of ask them like why that is. And students start to really, their eyes start, especially the young ones, start to really be like, I never really thought about that before, right? And then you look at pictures of our city council, of our mayor, of our judges, who's in those positions of power. And when you get into those kinds of conversations, which I never had conversations like that growing up, even at home. So when you have those kinds of conversations, students start to look at things with a critical lens. And I think that's how you get those conversations going. That's how you get students like starting to really think about how they can make active change, real change, as opposed to just focusing on the little things, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I think power, learning all about power, who has it, who doesn't have it, and why. When you teach about that specifically, I feel like students' eyes are opened. Mine too, because I learn a lot from when my students talk to me too. So it's also about talking about, I don't want to say I'm lucky, but it's easier for me to talk about my experiences as a Black educator, experiencing racism, experiencing oppression, even as a teacher. And so students, I think, yeah, they learn more when you have those conversations. It's about the language you're using in the classroom too, when we talk about just the way that we address our students, when we talk about pronouns, all those kinds of things, like addressing those things, talking about them, I think is what really is what anti-racist and anti-oppressive education is all about.
Yeah. It seems sometimes to me that sometimes kids that have a little bit more privilege and grow up with a little bit more privilege, some of these issues that other kids experience seem like such a shock to them when they eventually figure out that they're real. And when something is so different and so unexpected, it seems sometimes when they meet that at an older age, they meet it with resistance. So that's why it's so important to be so open with it at the education phase of their existence, because then it's something that's always there. It's something that they can always be learning about. And yeah, so that's really important and really awesome to hear. So as you just mentioned, the anti-racist and anti-oppressive education. And so how is that different from what is currently being taught in our province's curriculum?
Well, what I would say, and I can't really speak for the high school curriculum, although I'm pretty sure it's where we're at with the elementary curriculum, which is, again, even if it does talk about stereotypes, bias, and those kinds of things, it's all at the individual level. It doesn't mention specifically anti-racism in the curriculum. It doesn't mention anti-oppressive education in the curriculum. So a teacher could go into a classroom and teach an outcome that just says like, help students understand what a stereotype is or what a bias is, but they're not digging deeper, right? And so that's what's missing in our curriculum. We need it to be explicitly stated, like to teach anti-racist education, talk about the power. We do have like a, power and authority is a main focus in our curriculum, but it's not talking about that same, it's not talking about power dynamics between, minoritized groups and non-minoritized groups. It's not talking about that. It's talking about other things. So I think that's what's needed in our curriculum, is to explicitly state and make it an outcome that teachers need to ingrain anti-racist and anti-oppressive education into every subject area, honestly. Yeah. That's what's needed to be stated, I think. That's what needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Is there any anti-racism training for teachers at all?
There is. I can't speak for every school, but I know that, for example, in the school that I work in right now, we are making sure that at least once a month, one of our staff meetings, we're talking about anti-racist, anti-oppressive education in the classroom and practices that we can be using. And I'm on that committee with a few other people. And I have heard of other schools that are doing it. Is it mandatory right now? No.
Hmm.
Does it need to be? Yes. And so I feel like, I think that where I'm working, and I can't really go into a lot of detail about it, but I do feel like we're moving in that direction. And that's one of the things I'm advocating for, is that anti-racist training is mandatory, and it's not just a one-time thing at the beginning of the year. It's ongoing. It should be a part of teacher staff meetings throughout the year. We should be bringing in a lot of experts and other people to come in and talk about their experiences, talk about how we can be doing that in the classroom. That's what's needed. Is that what's happening in every school? Probably not. But it's happening in the schools where admin and staff are advocating for it.
Right. So a bit of a hot topic right now is whether or not books such as Of Mice and Men or To Kill a Mockingbird should be taught in schools at all. From a Black educator's perspective, do you believe that these books should be taught, or if there is a way that these books can be properly taught, or do you think that these books could always inevitably risk doing more harm than good to encouraging Black empowerment in the classroom?
That's a great question. I actually recently just made a post about this because I'm very passionate about this topic in particular. I feel like if there were more people of color and Black people specifically in positions of power in schools, this wouldn't even be a topic of conversation. I feel like these books would be banned. I feel like we don't need them. It is more harmful, I think, than not to use books like that in the classroom. If you're forced to right now use those books, then yes, they can be taught, but they need to be taught with a critical lens, I think, where you're critiquing the book, you're taking it apart as you're teaching it. And I know some teachers who do that when they have no other option but to teach those books. But I know what it's like as a Black person to be sitting in a classroom and have a teacher use the N-word, and so casually and with no hesitation, and everyone else looking at you in a really like uncomfortable way. It is a terrible feeling. And so for me personally, because I know how that feels, I would never use one of those books in the classroom. Now, to be fair, I have taught a book before that has the N-word in it. I taught the Book of Negroes to a grade 12 class at Newtana. What did I do? I prefaced that the N-word was in the book, and I said, we're not going to use it. Like you might read it when you're reading it at home, but we're not going to be using the N-word in class. And I said why we weren't going to use the N-word in class. And I had a few Black students in the classroom as well, who I talked to privately beforehand. And you need to be careful when you're having those conversations, because there's still a power dynamic there, right? Mm-hmm. But I felt from the conversation that we had two options, and Book of Negroes is one of them, and they wanted the Book of Negroes. And so I said, okay, then that's what we're going to do. And it was no problem. I had zero problems teaching that book. It was a great book. There's a lot of learning that can happen in that book, and we used it and it was great, but we just didn't use the word. And it shouldn't be allowed. It blows my mind that it's a topic of conversation still, whether they can use, I know you're talking about the books per se, but the problem with the books is the slurs in it, right? And so I hope, and I'm advocating for this too, that those books are just off the table. There's a lot of new books out there now that are more relevant now that can be used. So yeah, I think they do more harm than good. And I hope that we don't have to talk about these books in a few years. So that is my goal as an educator anyways.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like if there are other books out there, and there are, that cover similar subject matter and, allow an in-depth analysis of themes and, things like that, then why not just use other books that don't use such discriminatory language in them,
Yeah. And the other thing too is that they're not written by a person of color. So that's
exactly
another thing too, right? Even when I taught the Book of Negroes, at least it was written by a Black person as well. So I feel like at the very least, if you have to teach a book like that, make sure it's written by a person of color and not someone who isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Your Instagram account at SaskTeaches is all about promoting BIPOC empowerment, both in the classroom and in other aspects of life. Uh, However, though social media can be a source of inspiration, it can also be a source of a lot of uh, discouragement and negativity that ends up inadvertently circling around it. Um, what is an instance where you've been uplifted by social media, and how do you find the courage to keep pushing for what you believe in the face of adversity that will inevitably come on the internet?
Yeah. I started the account because I was tired actually of the shock and surprise that people were having when we mentioned things like the Starlight Tours or the Indian Act, things that have happened and that are still happening now. And I think what helps me keep going and what has inspired me through this account are the people that reach out to me. So I've had educators, other Black educators, other BIPOC educators who feel the same way or have talked to me about issues that they're having in their schools, and we've been able to connect, and I've kind of been able to make like a little circle of BIPOC friends that I didn't have before, which has been really nice because you're able to connect with them on a different level when you're talking about things like race and racism, right? I've had students reach out and tell me about problems they're having in schools, particularly with books like Of Mice and Men and stuff like that. And so hearing their stories and then hearing about seeing that there are teachers out there who are against it inspires them. Even some of them have talked to me about how they want to become a teacher now because they didn't know that teachers could, I guess, think the same way that a lot of people are thinking now. Honestly, it's been quite inspiring to hear from mostly the students, I would say. And that's what inspires me to keep going. When I hear about some students who are not getting much support at their school and they're advocating for change and they're not getting it, it makes me want to speak up louder. And I think just that, yeah, again, the connection I've been able to make with other people who are running the same kinds of accounts too has been pretty amazing. I think also from those conversations I've had, I've been able to get more ideas of things that I can try to implement in our school. And so that's been really great. For example, right now I'm advocating for a set rule of procedures that admin and teachers have to follow when racism occurs in schools, because right now it's up to the discretion of whoever's in charge. And personally for me, I've had lots of incidences of racism that have happened that haven't been dealt with properly. And so hearing those stories from students has encouraged me to keep fighting and advocating for that, because it still is kind of unbelievable that we don't have something that is set that everyone follows. So yeah, I guess that's the benefit of the social media. It can get kind of, a little depressing sometimes, some of the stuff you see and hear, but it's those stories of hearing students being empowered, connecting with like-minded individuals, coming up with new ideas, strategizing for how we can make our education system more anti-racist and anti-oppressive is what keeps me going.
Yeah. Something that you just mentioned just now is how certain situations are more difficult to deal with when it is left up to people who are more in charge. And so have there been any opportunities or, through colleagues that you've been working with to continue to push for more people of color represented in the higher up positions of the Board of Education?
Yes, actually, I have had lots of conversations with other administrators and people that are in higher positions than me about the need for more BIPOC educators in positions downtown. And this support has been like unbelievable. I thought I'd have more pushback than support. So they've actually, I've been invited to go into schools and to talk with other teachers and kind of gather some support in encouraging the hiring and recruitment and support of educators of color in our system, and in particular moving them up higher. I think the problem is that not enough people are coming into the education system that are people of color, and I genuinely believe that other than like the financial differences of being a teacher and all that stuff, it's the experiences that they're having in the classroom. Why would you want to be a part of something that made you feel othered or not supported? And if we can change that at the lower levels, hopefully more people will want to apply, and hopefully they'll move up. But yes, I've been advocating for that. And does that mean anything's going to happen right now? No, but I'm trying. I'm trying to. Yeah.
That's the best anyone can do.
Yeah.
So teachers are entrusted with an immense responsibility to plan, teach, guide, and encourage their students. What are some of the ways that students and parents can take on unlearning certain misconceptions or things that they've learned in their own education and relearning sort of more BIPOC perspectives and being more understanding and more open to learn those things beyond the classroom?
I think the first thing they need to do is reflect on where their position in society is. What are your biases? Where do you stand when it comes to issues of racism? Are you speaking up? Are you quiet and complicit? Those kinds of things. So doing the proper reading and kind of like, you can't do any anti-racist work. You can't be an ally or practice allyship unless you do the work yourself first, right? And so I think what parents and kids can do, or parents can help their children do, is figure out where their biases are. Like, reflect on why. Do you clutch your purse when a person of color walks by you, and it's when they're walking by you outside? Like, think about little things like that you do that you don't even think about, and how that affects, I guess, people of color. I think you need to reflect. You need to do a lot of learning. So a lot of unlearning first. You're right, of where you stand. Then you need to do some reading, and then you need to start practicing it. Admit that you have biases and can be racist. Stop thinking about racism. Everyone, when you're called a racist, it's almost like being called a slur in itself. When in actuality, you're either racist or every action is either racist or anti-racist, or everyone has racist tendencies or beliefs. And so it's just about acknowledging those beliefs, challenging them, and then trying to change them. And then, so once you've done that, admit to your children when you realize that you've done something wrong or you've been thinking the wrong way, to have those conversations. Normalize conversations about race. That's what we need to, I think that's the number one thing that people have to do. Yeah.
Have you met any adversity, while we're on the subject of parents? Have you met any adversity from parents specifically with any sort of complaints, or has it just been sort of, they allow their educator to educate the children in the way that they see fit and they let it be? Or have you had any parents sort of questioning that?
I haven't had any parent ever question me yet, and I've been really lucky in that sense to be, and I don't know what that has to do with. I do work in a classroom that is largely filled with people of color. And so I don't know, I'm just making assumptions here, but I feel like maybe it's because they know what it's like, and I'm not having to validate those experiences or prove to them that racism exists. And so I haven't had any pushback. And I think even if I did, my administrators are extremely supportive and dedicated to in their unlearning right now, and willing to listen. And so I think that I would still have their support. I don't know what it would be like at other schools. I have had teachers message me about pushback that they're having. But I myself have been really lucky in not having to have to deal with really any pushback at all.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
What are some of the the most fulfilling moments for you, having taken this approach, this very important approach at education? What have been some of the reactions or interactions that have, you know, given you the most hope in regards to your students?
I think it's seeing those aha moments when kids finally their eyes open a little bit wider, or they think, oh, you hearing them say, I work with like 7, 8, 9 year olds, right, in my classroom. So when they say something like, well, that's not fair, why is it that way? It makes you feel like, yeah, we're getting somewhere. I don't know if that makes sense. Hearing them talk about how something isn't fair, or like, what can we do like to fix that? We just had a conversation a few weeks ago about how it doesn't make sense that Canada's official languages are only English and French when we're so diverse, and First Nations people were here from the beginning. And a lot of the students were just flabbergasted. They couldn't think of a good reason why. And I think having those kinds of conversations is the most, I can't really describe the feeling, but it is an amazing feeling to see the kids make those connections and realize like these are the ones that are gonna, take on the system. I feel like as they get older. So it's those classroom discussions, those aha moments that make it everything worth it.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think that any kid is inherently racist or inherently prejudgmental of people based on skin color or religion or culture or anything like that. And so that's why it's so important, especially at younger ages, to just have that familiarity and that openness and that recognition of problems, so that when they grow up, it's not something that they're denying or something that they, learn someday and are resistant to because they feel so guilty, because to them it comes out of nowhere. And so it's just it's so important to have these things in education. So just thank you so much for pushing for that sort of education, because that's such an important thing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Did you have we sort of went through these questions faster than I was expecting. Did you have any other points that you wanted to touch on before we wrap it up here?
I think just to touch on what you were talking about with more BIPOC representation in the higher levels of education, I think just to say that I hope the people listening are in support of that and speak up to that. I think the louder that the people are, the more willing to listen. The more likely it is that they'll listen, as opposed to more voices are better than one. And so, not that there's only one, but in comparison. So I think speak up. If you see something that's unfair, speak up. If you could do anything like that I could get you to take away from this, is like, again, I said it like 15 times already, but normalize conversations about race with people around you. It's not taboo to point out that someone is different than you. It's just a matter of where you go from there. Just for example, if it's okay for me to say
yes,
this.
Yes, of course.
My son just started at a new daycare, and I got an email from the daycare telling me about an incident that happened at school. And so what happened was the kids were all sitting at a table at lunchtime, and another student pointed at my son and said, Kingsley, did you know that you're the only brown person here? Or the only Black person here? And what their teachers did at the daycare, instead of shushing that other kid, which is what most people would do, like shh, which would, in my mind, that just makes my son feel bad about being Black, which is, he shouldn't have to feel bad about that, is that they took that moment as a way to teach the kids more about our identity and how everyone comes in different colors. And they didn't single him out, but the kids learned later that afternoon, They just threw out what they were doing that afternoon. And instead they had an afternoon all about self-expression and how people all look different and can be different, but they're all, perfect the way they are. And of course at a kids at that age, you're not going to go into like the systems that oppress them because they're
Right.
4, but just doing that alone was huge and was amazing, because teachers, when I was a student, they didn't do that. They would just shush the other kids. Someone said something racist, don't say that, that's not okay. And the other person got scolded, and that was done. That was it. It was dealt with, right? And so both of those teachers, I think they gave me this long email about that, because they happen to be on social media as well. Like, they follow my account, and it just warmed my heart to know that people are listening, I guess, and are letting parents even know about things as small as that. That's a small thing that happened at daycare. And I'm sure in that moment, my son felt othered when he's getting pointed out in front of everyone else, but they took that moment to make him feel good about himself, and all the students to feel good about themselves. And I think if we could all just do that, the world would be a much better place. And so, yeah, I think things are changing, and we can be really hopeful. I feel like even though some days are harder than others, I think that we're all moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
And I think there's more people in support than not, I think.
Yeah. Well, we hope so, at least.
Yeah, I hope so anyways, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's a comfortable place to end things. Even this one might be a little bit shorter than our other episodes, but I don't see anything wrong with that. Did you want to draw attention to your social media or any websites or things like that?
I guess you could just mention if you're interested in learning more about this, and they could follow at SaskTeaches. But other than that, no, it's all good.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us. I greatly appreciated having a talk with you.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a great day.